Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I'm very excited to present some brand new humanoid cases for you, ones that I'm pretty sure you haven't heard before, ones that involve a wide variety of humanoids, cases of course from all over the world, reaching back to 1914 all the way up to 2018. So that's more than 100 years. The title of today's episode is They Were Not Human. 10 Incredible Humanoid Encounters. I think each of these cases has something to teach us, and I always try to pick cases that I think are well vetted, really compelling in some way, unique, or have something to teach us about the extraterrestrial presence on our planet. And the cases today I think fit that bill. They do involve a number of them, multiple witnesses, but also a wide variety of evidence such as landing traces, electromagnetic effects, animal reactions, and so on. And even one involving photographs, which is quite unusual. So the cases today come from Australia, Finland, Spain, Switzerland, Connecticut, Louisiana, New Jersey, North Carolina, Ohio, and Oregon. So quite a wide area geographically speaking. And yeah, some very compelling, interesting, and unusual cases. So let's just get started with our first case. First case I'm going to be covering today I call the Air People. This one occurred one day in August of 1914 in Alastaro, Finland. This is a really unusual case, not only because it's quite early in terms of being well before the modern age of UFOs and the idea that humanoids were visiting our planet, but the witnesses, one of them apparently is quite a high-level contactee. This very early case comes from researcher Tapani Kuningis and Mervi Virtanen and was published in his book Aliens and Humanoids in the Finnish language. Now Tapani received this case firsthand from the witness who shared it many decades after it occurred. The main witness is Akseli Kuopala. He was 10 years old, spending the summer with his grandmother, Maria Falt, on her farm located in the small village of Alastaro. This is near Vitis or Huitinen, Finland. So it was a summer day towards the end of August 1914, and they were inside this little cottage eating lunch when, without warning, or so it seemed to 10-year-old Akseli, darkness descended upon the environment outside, kind of like a sudden solar eclipse is how he described it, and at the same time there was a loud blowing or banging noise. So he and his grandmother ran to the kitchen window of the farmhouse and saw what at first looked to Akseli like a bright shining wall coming down from the eastern sky. But as it approached, he saw that it was actually a white glowing sphere, and as it descended down over the backyard, it reached the height of the window. So it was just above the ground, and it began to move slowly horizontally, even closer to them, right over the yard, until it was, he estimates, only about 6 or 7 feet away. And he could now see that this was a large metallic sphere. Almost immediately, an oval window appeared on the side of this sphere, and 2 figures could be seen inside. Only their upper bodies and heads were visible. One stood in the center of the opening, while the other was off to the side and slightly behind. According to the witness, they had unusually large heads and were very short. Akseli had the impression that they were male. The one in the center part of the window, he said, looked really old and had a broad, angular face, but friendly-looking eyes. But he thought that the one behind the first one was terribly ugly. That's how he put it. So he became frightened that these little men would invade their home, at which point his grandmother immediately reassured him and said that there was no danger and that the little men, which she called, quote, air people, had only come to say something, to deliver a message. Now it seemed to the witness that his grandmother had been somehow forewarned of this encounter, had predicted the event somehow, knew these beings were coming. At any rate, the man in the center section of the window smiled and began to speak. Akseli saw that the little man's mouth was moving, but he couldn't hear any sound, and he shouted out excitedly to his grandmother, "Now it's talking! It is saying something!" Now no sooner did he say this, when this little man apparently stopped talking, stepped back from the window, the opening closed, this craft made a loud roaring noise, emitted a bright flash of light, this sphere rose upwards and moved off to the west, disappearing into the distance. So the total duration of this sighting was only a few minutes. Now this is interesting because following this encounter, Oxeli was overcome with tiredness and actually fell asleep much earlier than he normally would have. He woke up later that evening, at which point his grandmother then explained that the humanoids were not angels who came from heaven, but instead, she said, came from a distant place. She said that they came to Earth in a large, quote, skyship, and that the sphere was actually a smaller craft which was used only for short trips. He explained that the beings had such large heads because they were more intelligent than humans, but that they were distantly related to us and also lived much longer lives than humans did. She said that she had been in contact with them several times before, and that they had often delivered important messages to her, basically predicting future events. She said that the beings wanted to protect humanity, but that was all she told him. It was clear to Oxeli that she had a lot more information about these beings. Unfortunately, he did not get any further details, and that was his only encounter with them. That's the kind of case that I find not only really interesting, but somewhat frustrating. I would love to have more detail on what exactly these ETs looked like, and particularly what kind of messages the grandmother was getting from them, and how many other contacts did she have? Was she ever taken on board? She seemed to know a lot about these visitors that came to her little farm there. And unfortunately, this is just one of countless cases which has apparently been lost to posterity. So kudos to the grandson for coming forward and sharing his experience with these ETs. But what a fascinating and early case. Now let's move to the next one. I found this case to be particularly compelling because it does involve multiple witnesses, at least one who became quite well known. And this is a very close-up encounter as well. I call this one, No One Will Believe It. This occurred on May 30th, 1954 in East Malvern, Australia. And it's got some really unusual elements to it, as we'll see. At 12:25, 25 minutes after midnight on May 30th, 1954, 5 men and 1 woman stood on the doorstep of their friend's home on Wilmot Street in East Malvern, Victoria, Australia. You can see the exact location here. They had had a dinner party and they were saying their goodbyes to each other when, to their unified amazement, a truck-sized UFO, roughly the shape of a football, appeared overhead, then swooped down in a sweeping curve right towards them. One of the witnesses was Christopher Muir, a 22-year-old radio announcer and soon to be a famous producer. He said, and I quote, "I don't know what attracted my attention to the sky. It was not a noise. However, I looked towards the east and saw an orange glow which seemed to be very low. I would guess the glow was as low as 60 or 70 feet above me at its lowest stage. But that sounds ridiculous, and I'm willing to believe that it is. The glow was an aura of light surrounding something darker, something almost the size of a railway carriage and the shape of a football. It moved in a half circle coming down to us." Also among the group was 18-year-old David Reese. He was a technical liaison officer at a radio station, and as he says, and again I quote, "As we were talking at the front gate, I heard a noise. It was a burr, burr, just like it sounds to you there as I make the noise, like the dial tone in a telephone. I looked about me and saw nothing out of the ordinary. My head finished up, so I was looking straight ahead at an angle of 10 degrees when out of nowhere appeared this oval shape. The sky was black, and the oval was a lighter color than the sky blue color. Not a light blue, but a luminous yet darkish blue. This football-like object was traveling in an arc. When it reached the nadir of the arc, it belched out a gaseous yellow-orange smoke. This made me look at my companions. I said something like 'hell' or 'cripes' to express my amazement. I noticed they were all looking at the object, so I quickly looked back. It was then that I took notice of its speed. It appeared to be floating gently, yet I had the sensation of terrific and fantastic speed. Yet it appeared to be moving slowly. It was as if time and speed had become distorted. Now you can see their original drawing here, which has received almost no publicity. Now another witness, the sole woman, was a 23-year-old school teacher from the country who insisted on being anonymous because, as she says, country people would regard anyone who told such a story as quite wacky. So she told reporters that the object was, quote, pear-shaped with a beam of light extending from the blunt end, a noise too hard to describe. It was traveling low and fast in the direction of the southeast. Now the radio announcer, Christopher Muir, said that after the object swooped down to 60 feet above their heads, it, quote, moved up and away. As it reached the lowest point of the curve and was about to rise, it belched out a ball of orange flame. Whether this was from its front or back, I don't know. Then it disappeared. It didn't just dwindle away to a pinpoint like a plane, it just vanished. I'm sure as you can be about something rather strange as this was, that what I saw was a machine. I know this sounds pretty wet, but it did something to the air. The air seemed to get warmer, and there was a feeling as if it had caused some suction. I had the idea I was being drawn up. Now, most amazing is that these witnesses saw occupants inside the craft. As Christopher Muir says, one moment it was there, and the next it was gone. Through what looked like portholes or windows, there were reflections of some sort which resembled people. It was not frightening, just terrifically interesting. Now David Rees agrees. As he says, it just seems that no one will believe that part of it, but okay, here it is. After I said hell or something, and I looked at my friends for a fraction of a second, when I looked at my companions while the object was still in sight, I noticed they looked peculiar. They were bathed in an amber light. I looked back into the sky, and I saw, or I should say I appeared to see, shadows inside the object. To me they looked human. They were immobile and could have been anything but humans, but I had it in my mind that I was looking at passengers. I could distinctly see inside it dark shapes like busts. The aircraft looked as if it were made of glass. You could see into it, but not entirely through it. Then it completed the rise of the arc and disappeared like a pricked balloon. I looked back to where it had belched out the colored smoke, but saw nothing. Now the fourth witness was a police officer, aged 30, who requested anonymity, and he wrote in a statement that, quote, I saw an oval-shaped machine speed from the sky and hover low, about 60 feet above the ground. Scarlet flames were shooting out from it. Shadows of some people, I think, could be seen for several seconds. It disappeared with a tremendous roaring sound. The fifth witness was a clerk in his late 30s who did not want his name used, as his friends, he said, would think he was, quote, round the bend. He said that the object made, quote, a whirring noise that frightened me. A yellow flame spurted from the rear like a Buck Rogers rocket ship. There seemed to be vague people shadowed in the strange light emitted from the oval-shaped ship. Now the sixth witness was a technician, 25 years old, and he told reporters that, quote, a large circular object about the shape of a plate appeared about 40 feet or 50 feet above the ground. It would be hard to judge the distance. It was just above the trees, traveling fast. There was a possibility of seeing people. I saw yellowish flames. So this whole sighting was pretty brief, lasting no more than 10 seconds. But afterwards, all six witnesses looked at each other in astonishment, making comments like, did you see that? Wasn't it fantastic? Now one of them, David Rees, suggested that they all return inside and immediately and separately produce written statements, which they did. Later, officers from the RAAF showed great interest in this encounter and actually interrogated David Rees and Christopher Muir for more than 2 hours. RAAF public relations officers said of the reports, it would be stupid to ignore them. We believe there's something flying around which cannot be regarded as the figment of someone's imagination. Now, after their story was published, another witness surfaced who was approximately only 2 miles from the witnesses and said that on that same night he saw a saucer fly over his house at a height of about 70 feet, which then climbed rapidly away at fantastic speed. He provided the same description as the others and said, quote, "I am well known, and I will not give my name for publication, because many people have the idea that flying saucer reports come from crackpots. It was not just my imagination." It seems like every case raises more questions than answers. That case, to me, is really compelling because not only of the multiple witnesses, but how close this craft came. Their description makes me wonder if perhaps this could be a reverse-engineered craft. It's quite early in time for that, but I do think that there is some good compelling evidence that we were reverse engineering way back into the 1950s. So we have to leave that as an open question. But again, there's some other details, like one of the witnesses described feeling drawn up into the air a little bit. That's interesting. Also interesting is another of the witnesses describing how time seemed to slow down, or that the craft was moving very quickly, but at the same time he felt like time was stretching out. Something's going on there. That's that weird Oz effect that turns up in so many cases. I also found it interesting that the military expressed an interest in this case. So clearly they were curious and took it seriously, even though at that time, of course, all the militaries around the world were saying there's nothing to this. It's all hoaxes, hallucinations, misperceptions, and mental illness. Go away, UFOs are not real. But that one was a case that absolutely seemed to rise above those ridiculous debunking explanations. So now let's move to the next case. This one is so unusual, perhaps the most unusual in this compilation. I call this one, "We Are Coming to Get You." This occurred one evening in June of 1961 in New Orleans, Louisiana. To me, this case is particularly interesting because it involves a graveyard encounter. I did a whole episode on cases which occurred over cemeteries and graveyards. There's no doubt in my mind that ETs show a particular interest in these areas. There's many reasons why this might be happening. Perhaps to collect implants from deceased abductees, perhaps to collect DNA, or perhaps some other reason. But there are dozens upon dozens of cases of UFOs not only hovering over graveyards, but landing, humanoids being seen, and this is one of them. And the aftermath of this encounter is even more interesting. The witness in this case has requested anonymity, so I've given her the pseudonym Doris. Another witness is her fiancé Joe. That is his real name. It was around 8 p.m. one evening in June of 1961 that Doris and Joe had parked their car in the parking lot of the famous L'Enfant restaurant. This is located at 5236 Canal Boulevard in New Orleans. You can see the exact location here. This restaurant had a very large parking lot overlooking the massive Greenwood Cemetery. The restaurant has since been torn down to make way for the Greenwood Funeral Home. So this parking lot was very popular among teenage couples as a kind of lover's lane where they could make out without the interference of adults. So Doris and Joe were sitting in their car in the parking lot talking when they saw something they could not easily explain. And I'll just quote Doris directly. As she says, "We were talking when I noticed something moving in the cemetery between the tombs. It seemed especially odd since the people moving seemed to be small, maybe 3.5 to 4 feet tall. The activity was brisk, as I could see the shadows between the graves moving back and forth in what appeared to be working. I saw small lights with some of the movement. My fiancé noted this activity and asked me if I was seeing what he was seeing. He described the same things I had noticed. We speculated that it would be very strange for children to be in there at night or at any time. This cemetery is locked every night. We compared the size of the kids to the size of the tombs and concluded their height. The tombs in this cemetery are all raised, with some standing as high as 5 or 6 feet or more, so it was pretty easy for them to estimate the height of these figures. And as Doris says, as we sat in disbelief just watching all this activity, we also noticed that we were the only ones parked who weren't necking, and probably the only ones who noticed this. We watched for at least 10 minutes, fascinated. Then all the movement seemed to move to the right and were no longer backlit, so we could not see them. Now, curious and puzzled, they just kind of shrugged and carried on with their conversation, but it was just a few minutes later they saw something which astonished them and provided the answer to who or what these small figures might be. As Doris says, within several minutes we saw, on the right, lights coming on in a large circle. These were not any kinds of lights I had ever seen. Although they were illuminated, they did not give off light as usual. Rather, they were pure, the opposite of pitch black, if that makes sense. We stared fixed on this large landed object and watched as it lifted off the ground. Our windows were open, and there was no sound. We were about 60 to 80 feet from this object. It lifted straight up slowly, then it stopped where we could clearly see that it was round and had a rounded top and flat bottom. Then the white lights went off, and a triangle of lights appeared underneath the craft, one red, one green, one white, and then it took off towards the west at an amazing rate of speed, continuing to climb and move away from us. We just sat there. We couldn't speak. So this whole sighting lasted at least 10 minutes. They estimate that this craft had a diameter of about 50 feet. It rose up to the height of a 5-story building before darting away quickly. Doris and Joe looked around at the other cars, but again, nobody else seemed to have noticed this craft. Shaken by their experience, they decided to drive to the home of Doris's best friend, Ida, and separately tell their stories to her. Ida confirmed that their stories matched. The next day after high school, Doris and Joe gathered some of their friends and drove back to the cemetery to investigate. And examining the area, they saw that the craft had landed in an open grassy area near some newly built vacant tombs. And then they found something which confirmed their encounter. As Doris says, as we got out and walked this area, we noticed the grass was flattened completely in a perfect large circle, but it was not burned or otherwise damaged. Fearing ridicule, we told no one else. Now, the strangest part of their experience was yet to come. Over the next month, they hoped to hear some reports from other witnesses on radio or TV, but there were no reports. 1 month after the encounter, Doris was in her home studying for finals in the bedroom, and she fell asleep with her book open and the lights on. It was at 3 a.m. she woke up abruptly when she heard a male voice calling to her to look out her bedroom window. As Doris says, I got up to the window and looked out. I saw nothing, but again I heard the voice. It was not out loud, but in my head. The voice was an adult male. So this voice told Doris, quote, "We are coming to get you to take you home. We will be there shortly." Doris responded telepathically, "I'm not going unless Joe and Ida are going too." And the voice replied and said, "They are going too." In somewhat of a daze and feeling strange, Doris quickly packed a suitcase. She actually wrote a goodbye letter to her parents, telling them that she was going home and who to give her possessions to. As Doris says, "Then I sat on the bed to wait. It seemed like a long time went by before I heard the man's voice again. Again, he instructed me to come to the window. He told me that plans had changed for now and they couldn't come, but that they would be back for me another time." At that point, Doris went to bed, but the next morning she called Ida and asked her if anything strange had happened the previous night. And to Doris's surprise, Ida said yes. As Doris says, "She told me that she was awakened by a man's voice telling her he was coming for her and that Joe and I would be there too. She laughed and went back to sleep." So that was interesting confirmation. Doris then called her fiancé Joe, and he related the same story. But neither Joe nor Ida received the second message like Doris did. In confirmation of this experience, Doris did keep the letter she wrote, and final confirmation of the event came many years later. After Doris and Joe had married, they had 2 kids. They were listening to the radio when the DJ on the show started talking about UFOs and asked for people to call in and share their stories. And as Doris says, I did. He listened intently and then told me to be sure and stay tuned because I was in for a surprise. I called Joe so he could come listen too. As the DJ related many sightings in the area, he made direct reference about the craft coming from the cemetery, which had been seen by people in every different direction of the area, including people who were on the interstate when this happened. So that was confirmation with witnesses Doris didn't even know about. Doris is now retired, but for years she worked as a registered nurse in the ICU, headed a quality management department at a large hospital, and was a medical legal analyst, a good witness. And as Doris says, I consider myself to be intelligent and open-minded. I've had other experiences and sightings as well. There you go, a multiple witness case, more witnesses than even the witness originally thought, landing traces, and of course that weird after effect with the witness receiving a telepathic message that the ETs are coming to get her. Yikes. I mean, there are a number of cases like that, but this one is particularly unusual in that 3 people apparently received this same message. Really unusual and quite fascinating. So now let's move to the next case. This one really touched me profoundly. I think this one affected the witness in ways that continued to affect him for the rest of his life. It's really an amazing case, which I call God, Don't Let Me Die. This one occurred over a period of years, actually, with one major encounter in 1966 and another in 1984 in Washington Township, New Jersey. And the main witness in this case is apparently quite a famous musician, although in this report he is anonymous. Again, the witness in this case is anonymous, but he does provide his initials, J.S. He says he's a successful musician who's actually played with Jimi Hendrix, John Denver, Little Richard, the Hermits, the Everly Brothers, and more. His first encounter occurred when he was a young man in 1966. At that time, he was living with his parents on Chapel Heights in Washington Township, New Jersey. Now, his job as a musician entailed a lot of late-night driving, and one evening after a band job, he and his drummer were driving home when he started to get a weird feeling that, as he said, something in the sky was watching us. And this feeling persisted for weeks and even continued when he was at home. So then, one evening, he arrived at his parents' home around 3 a.m. and prepared to go to sleep. Little did he know, his life was about to change forever. He was lying in bed when, as he says, suddenly, out of the darkness at the foot of my bed, a beautiful blue light appeared out of nowhere. It was small at first, almost sulfuric in color. As I watched it, frozen and unable to move or call for my parents, it began to grow in size, swirling in a clockwise motion. It became the size of a 4-foot by 4-foot screen of sorts, and out of this bluish screen came 3 alien heads. They were the typical grays, with slits for a nose, a slit for a mouth, vertical eyes. They spoke to me telepathically, but I was terrified and kept repeating, God, don't let me die. It was fairly lengthy, I'm not sure how long. Once it became clear to them that I was not listening perhaps, they faded back into the light. Once gone, the entire process went backwards. The light moved in a counterclockwise motion, becoming smaller until it reached a golf ball size again. Then it simply vanished into thin air as though it was never there. I was freed of the cold and the inability to move, and I ran into my parents' room, frightened and describing what had taken place. So he and his parents talked for an hour, and then he went to bed. But following this event, oddly, it was never discussed again. Though some years later, in the mid-1970s, the witness did write to Project Blue Book and submitted his experience. And there was a very interesting after effect to his encounter that started about 13 years later. He believes it is related. As J.S. says, in 1979, I began to experience a series of visions pertaining to future events. All these visions were experienced while waking in the morning, sitting on the edge of my bed. They involved such catastrophic events, such as the cutting off of the oil supply to the United States, which will bring total chaos, such as we have never seen in this country. I predicted Hurricane Frederick, which struck the Mobile area in 1979, causing great damage. To date, I have predicted a number of major events, mainly natural disasters or things that spell doom in some way or another. Now, the witness says he shared his predictions with many people before they happened, and word about his predictions spread, and in 1980, he says he was contacted by researchers from the television show That's Incredible. And after interviewing him and some witnesses to his predictions, he appeared as a guest on the show. He says his story has also appeared in newspapers such as the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Mobile Press Register, the Gloucester County Times, the Camden Courier Post, and others. He says he takes no credit for his predictions, he makes no claims about being psychic, and he believes that the ETs are responsible. He does not really like having predictions, as he says. All this has been incredibly stressful, as one might imagine, a true burden to carry over so many years. Now, he says that in 1980, he and his wife witnessed a, quote, very large UFO, which crossed silently over the face of the moon not far from the Philadelphia airport. But what he calls, quote, the most amazing experience of all occurred at 10:45 p.m. on August 11, 1984. He and his wife had just gone to bed and were still awake when, as he says, and I quote, out of nowhere, a glowing blue ball of light appeared at the foot of our bed, a beautiful light that hung there for a bit as we stared at it, holding each other's hands. Then it started to move towards us until it was a foot or two from our faces. It moved in front of us, going from side to side, as though we were being examined or studied in some way. We both watched it, I with tears streaming down my face. We were fully awake and whispering to each other as this happened, not frightened, but fully involved in this incredible thing that was taking place. Then it moved away again, centered above the bed, and then, out of the ball of light, came a display that was not of this earth. It sent beams of light in every direction. They were of shapes that neither of us have ever seen before, nor could we describe them. The light show it produced was spectacular, filling the room. It kept sending out these astounding rays of colors and shapes. Now at this point, they both shared what appears to be either an out-of-body experience or perhaps some kind of on-board experience. As J.S. says, we were both lifted into the clouds and even described the feeling to each other as we were awake all this time. We were floating in the clouds side by side, still holding each other's hands and watching the room's ceiling disappear. All we saw was the sky above us as we lay in the clouds. Next, we returned to the bed. The light show ended, and the blue light returned to the foot of the bed and vanished. It left us in the darkened room in disbelief, and excited, of course. So they immediately got out of bed and went into the living room to talk about what happened, and this is when they looked at the clock and got a huge surprise. They saw that it was now past 4 a.m. This experience felt like it was about 15 minutes long, but in fact hours had passed. Both were very much stunned. J.S. calls it, quote, a miracle, and he says that he and his wife, quote, will never forget it. That case is a good example of how a close encounter can be a little bit of a mixed bag for the witness, being incredibly frightening, but at the same time providing incredible illumination, enlightenment perhaps. So there were positive and negative aspects to that encounter. To me, the most interesting aspect is these predictions that this witness allegedly gave and was apparently correct. I would love to find those newspaper articles he's talking about. I did look for them. I couldn't find them. It was really difficult not knowing his name. I suspect that would make the research into this case a lot easier. So there's still a lot to unpack with that case. I would love to talk to this witness. Fortunately, without his name, I don't have any way to reach out to him. But every investigation is never closed. So who knows? Perhaps more answers will be forthcoming. Now let's move to the next case. This is another witness that I really feel for because you can tell this encounter frightened him quite badly. I call this one The Thing of Nightmares. This is a multiple witness case which occurred around 1971 in Crestline, Ohio. And this is a very close-up encounter which has some unusual aspects in terms of what the ET looked like and what it did. So I think you'll find it a pretty compelling and important case. This case comes from a man who struggled for years with his encounter that occurred to him when he was just a young boy in Crestline, Ohio. I've given him the pseudonym George. It was a beautiful day in 1979 when George's mom asked him to go pick some black raspberries from the bushes in the fields behind their house, and she said she would pay him 50 cents for each bucket of berries that he brought. So George agreed, but decided to call his friends Dwight V. and Tim M. to help him. They each had a bucket and spent the next hour or two in the fields about 300 yards behind the house. They filled the buckets once, then went back to get some more. By this time it was dusk, so they worked furiously to finish before night fell. And as George says, "I was farthest out in the field in the center when I saw something strange in front of me. It was a silver ball, but I have no idea how big it was. It could have been hundreds of feet or inches across, or it could have been the size of a basketball. I really don't know. If it hadn't been moving, I might not have seen it there in amongst the weeds, but it began moving in a very strange pattern. From where I was standing, it looked exactly like it was bouncing along the top of the berry bushes from left to right. I don't know what it was, but I thought maybe it was a ball that had been thrown, or perhaps a frisbee on its side. There were no structures or people out there. There was just bushes, trees, and weeds, and in moments this strange object had disappeared. He immediately ran and told his friends Tim and Dwight. Tim teased him, but Dwight seemed interested, started to plow through the thick brush to investigate. So Tim and George followed. By this time, the sun had set and it was starting to get fully dark. As George says, Dwight was still pressing into the bushes, but hadn't gone very far when we began to hear the sound of something coming through the weeds at us. It sounded heavy and quiet, just the sound of berry branches being crushed and occasionally a popping or snapping. So these weeds were taller than the boys, so they couldn't really see anything, but as they burst into a clearing, the sound became much louder, and it was still coming towards them. This scared them, so they took off running. Dwight ran towards the neighbor's house, while Tim and George ran towards George's backyard. They still had their buckets in hand. Tim reached the safety of the yard first, turned and waited for George, and suddenly the noise started again, coming from directly behind a large wood pile in George's backyard. So hearing this noise, Tim dropped his bucket and ran. And as George says, "But I hesitated. This was my yard. Surely it wouldn't come into my yard." Then the wood pile made some loud cracking noises, and that's when I saw it. I've never seen anything like it before or since. So it was a humanoid, which looked so strange to George that he really wasn't even sure what he was looking at. He said it had a weirdly corrugated head, and with the reddish glare of the sunset behind it, the head took on the appearance of being almost coiled, he said, like exposed brain or coiled hair. The rest of its body was shadowed in black. So it was very strange looking in any case. And as George says, all I saw was the head and the neck. The head was overly large for the neck, and the sunset was behind it, causing it to have red light all around it. I only looked long enough to register what it was. I only caught a glimpse of a head that had corrugations on top, something like the convolutions of a brain, or perhaps dreadlocks, with the red light shining down in it. Its eyes were strange and seemed lidless, with something like goggles over them. Lower down, I could see an extremely thin neck. It looked segmented, like a flexible conduit pipe, and tinted the ruddy red of the setting sun. Once it came up above the woodpile, I got one solid look, but it was fast. It stuck its head up so fast. It was there at least a second before I dropped my bucket and took off running after Tim. So great was my fright at that point that I caught up and almost passed Tim as we came up to the side of the house. They burst into George's house terrified, so that George's mom could immediately tell that something had seriously scared them. She called up Dwight's mother to make sure that he had made it safely home. He had. Tim insisted that they watch him as he grabbed his bike, and he quickly pedaled off to his house. They then called him to see that he made it home safely. And as George says, "The next day, my dad called me back to the woodpile. There was my berry bucket where I had dropped it, but it was the woodpile he wanted to show me. The pile was broken in two, with both sides looking as though they had been grasped and ripped apart. My dad gave me one of those weird looks and asked if I was sure I didn't do that. But at the look on my face, he just left it be." This experience affected George profoundly for decades afterwards. Afterward, he became afraid to go out at night in the backyard, and at first he thought it was some kind of boogeyman that he had seen. Only years later, after pondering the incident, he believes he may have had 20 minutes missing time, and that it was likely he encountered some kind of ET. Later, while watching sci-fi or monster movies, he would get scary flashbacks of the encounter. Finally, almost 50 years later, he decided to report his encounter, and as he says, "It haunts my dreams. For a very young boy, it has been the thing of nightmares for years. I just felt it was time to tell this." Pretty darn interesting. You can see that fear played a powerful role in that encounter. There were 3 witnesses, only one saw the humanoid, but I have to wonder what would have happened if they just stood their ground and did not run away. How would this encounter have unfolded? Because apparently no one was harmed. There was nothing nefarious going on as far as we can tell. But I certainly can't blame the witnesses for running away or, experiencing fear, because something like this has got to be particularly unnerving. So many people describe this sort of thing. Having an encounter that's completely out of your worldview challenges you on multiple levels. And you can see that this brief encounter affected this witness for the rest of his life. So let's move to the next case. This one is also really unusual and kind of raises more questions than answers. It's also a multiple witness case and apparently involves more than just a simple sighting. I call this one, "They Were Not Human." This one occurred one evening in May of 1976 in Ridgefield, Connecticut. And what's interesting to me is this took place in a pretty crowded suburban area where you think a lot of people would have seen this. And maybe they did and just didn't report it. Hard to say. But it's another case of real close-up encounter with humanoids. The witness in this case is anonymous, so I've given him the pseudonym Charlie. It was just before midnight one evening in the early spring of 1976, as Charlie and his then wife, they are now separated, were asleep in their second-story apartment home located at the Casagmo Apartments in Ridgefield, Connecticut. You can see them here. They had their large sliding window open a few inches when Charlie was awakened by a loud buzzing noise. He at first thought it was coming from outside and covered his head with a pillow to block off the noise, and that's when he realized that the noise was, quote, "inside my head." He got up and looked out the window and saw 3 figures who he initially thought must be electrical workers. But he started to notice some strange details. They were dressed oddly, wearing shiny chrome-like helmets and what looked like dark, quote, wetsuits with mittens. Also, they appeared to be short, 5 feet tall or less. He got a good view of them as there was a floodlight above them, so he turned to his wife and said, "What are those idiots doing out there in the middle of the night?" Because not only did they look strange, they were acting strangely. One was looking up the nearby tree line, the other was looking around as if to, quote, "keep watch," and the third was studying the ground intently. The inexplicable buzzing noise was still as loud as ever, so puzzled, Chuck was watching them from behind a potted plant in the bedroom when something even stranger happened. As Chuck says, the 3 individuals suddenly turned as if they were given a command and faced directly at the window where I was standing. I felt immediately uncomfortable and crouched down behind the plant, so Chuck could now see their helmets more clearly. He said they looked almost like, quote, "an ancient Egyptian headdress." Also, he said they had what looked like large reflective goggles over their eyes, or perhaps it was just their eyes. He really wasn't sure. He said he saw what looked like a reflective stripe on their pants. So all of this was strange enough that he called his wife to take a look, and as she did, the three figures turned in sync to the right. They then began to walk away, and as they did, they began to blink in and out of view, as if there was some kind of strobe light. It was very strange. Two of them went behind the maintenance garage, but one walked out into an open field and promptly disappeared into thin air. Chuck's wife also said that it appeared that the figures were moving in slow motion. So the next day, Chuck went out and examined the area, but found nothing unusual. He told a friend about the sighting, and his friend encouraged him to report it to a UFO center, which he did. And he was told by investigators that there had been numerous reports in that area around that time. 5 years later, he decided to try hypnotic regression and was surprised to recall being outside his apartment face to face with these strange individuals. He recalled seeing their eyes close up and yelling for help, but little else. That was all the hypnotic regression revealed. But he was convinced that the beings he saw were not human, not normal. As Chuck says, "I saw individuals that were not human." The memory is still vivid after nearly 27 years. I have rarely shared this information with anyone. My ex-wife refused to talk about it. That certainly does sound like this is more than just a sighting in terms of, a face-to-face encounter with humanoids, but perhaps an actual onboard case, even though the witness does not recall that. But under hypnosis, he did find himself outside of his apartment. So yeah, that raises all kinds of questions. A really compelling encounter that, like all these cases, I wish we could dig a little deeper into. But I think the best evidence that something really profound is happening here is not just one case or two cases, but the totality of cases. When we have tens of thousands of cases like these coming from all over the world and occurring decade after decade after decade, being reported by all kinds of people who don't know each other, it's not easy to dismiss these as hoaxes, hallucinations, misperceptions, and mental illness, the go-to that our governments always try to debunk these cases with. It's a shame. Now let's move to the next case. This one did get some moderate publicity. It's a really interesting case. Again, multiple witnesses, a really very unusual humanoid, UFOs flying around and landing. I call this one UFO Landing and Humanoid. This one occurred on October 11, 1977 in Nyon, Switzerland, and it's an amazing case. Also, what I like about this case is the witness was able to provide her own drawing and sketch of the humanoid and the craft that she saw. This next case was thoroughly investigated by the Swiss Ufology Federation, and it involves a series of events culminating in a UFO landing with humanoids. It began on the morning of October 11, 1977, when a Mrs. V woke up in her home in Nyon, Switzerland, to prepare breakfast for her husband. And this is when she noticed a silver-colored, cylindrical-shaped object moving silently and slowly in the sky. It looked to her almost like a trout without fins. She said it was shaped kind of like a piece of rice. So she pointed it out to her husband, Rene, who took a look at it and immediately dismissed it as a plane. Now, Mrs. V vehemently disagreed with this, and she continued to watch it. This object circled around the house at a distance. Their daughter, Natalie, saw it, but Natalie had to go to school, and Rene had to go to work. Mrs. V had chores to do, so she stopped watching this object. It was around 9 a.m. that her niece, Brigitte, age 19, woke up. She was spending time at her aunt's house, so Brigitte used binoculars to observe this object, which was now hovering on the other side of the house. At this point, Mrs. V saw it again, and they alerted their neighbors to the presence of this object, and they also saw it. So while her aunt and neighbor continued their chores, Brigitte kept her eye on this object and watched in surprise as this object appeared to divide into three separate objects. She immediately again alerted her aunt and neighbor, and all three watched two of these objects move off and one object begin making dramatic maneuvers, zigzagging, hovering, zipping across the sky. At this point, all three noticed a strong sulfuric odor. So this object continued to move in and out of view all day long. At 2:30 p.m., Brigitte and Natalie, who had returned home from school, noticed a thin column of smoke in the cornfield off in the distance. So Brigitte grabbed the binoculars, and she could see this metallic dome-shaped craft-looking object sitting in the field. So she and Mrs. V and Natalie all went to investigate. Mrs. V became frightened and ran home, and the cats were following Natalie, so she stopped going there. So Brigitte continued on alone. As she's walking towards this thin column of smoke and this apparent craft, a man stopped along the road and asked her what was wrong. Why was she looking up? Brigitte began to explain about the UFO she had been looking at, and he said that he had actually seen what appears to be the same object in this area that morning. But then he continued on his way. So Brigitte walked to the end of the field and stopped in amazement. Peering through the corn stalks, she was amazed to see a humanoid figure about 120 to 130 feet away from her. So she crouched down and hid behind the plants and looked and saw that this being looked human, except for the color of his face, which was sort of a greenish blue. He also had a slightly curved nose. He was wearing a metallic, loose-fitting suit, quote, like that of a mechanic. She said it had what looked like 5 buttons on the front. She said he wore a hood, gloves, boots, had a metallic belt from which dangled a 20-centimeter, 8-inch long object. Now directly behind this humanoid was a smooth, silver metallic flying saucer, about the size of a large car. It was completely smooth, no doors, no seams, no markings of any kind. All it had on top was a rotating green light. Brigitte was very much frightened by the appearance of this being, which she called, quote, repelling. So she fled the area, and arriving at the opposite corner of the field, she turned around just in time to see this object rising vertically and gently. She now saw that it had 3 what looked to her like landing legs ending in a small point. This object moved off slowly to the west and was gone. When she arrived home, she noticed that the cows were strangely excited, and their dog, normally very quiet, was barking furiously, and would actually continue to bark for the next 3 days. The second day after the encounter on October 12, Brigitte was walking home along the Saint Serge Road when she saw the same craft, apparently the same craft, hovering about 40 feet above a tree 300 feet away. The only difference, she said, was that she saw no landing legs. She watched for a full half hour, during which she said, strangely, there was no traffic on the road. Later, Mrs. V told investigators that she found an area of the ground that looked, quote, like it had been sucked up by a suction cup, though investigators were unsure if this was caused by the craft or not. So there you go, at least 6 witnesses to this case, although only one saw the humanoid. Animal reactions, apparent landing traces. There's quite a lot to it. I always wonder, what are these ETs doing landing at farmhouses? Were they there to get the corn? I don't know. I suspect there's always a reason behind these landings. Perhaps sometimes it's just a display. Perhaps they're picking people up. Very hard to say for sure, but there are so many cases like it, where these craft just land, the humanoids come out, go back in, and off it goes. Very strange. Now let's move to the next case, which I call an absolute silence. This one occurred on March 12, 1981 in El Cobre, Spain. This is a single witness case, but it's interesting to me because it sort of typifies what UFO researchers call the Oz effect, where an eerie silence surrounds an area. But it's also a fascinating case of a very close-up observation of a landed UFO, very unusual humanoids, and kind of an interesting location as well. This case is featured in Iker Jimenez's book, Encuentros OVNI, or UFO Encounters, the history of UFOs in Spain. The witness is Juan Gonzalez Santos, and on the evening of March 12, 1981, he was driving along the N340 highway near an area known as El Cobre, not far from Algeciras, located in Cadiz, Spain. So he knew this area quite well and was surprised when he saw a large object sitting in an isolated field next to the highway. It was right near a property known as Marchanilla. You can see it here. The craft then flashed a light 2 or 3 times, and Juan had the distinct impression that it was trying to attract his attention, which of course it did. Now, intensely curious, Juan parked his car, got out, and began to approach the area on foot. And as he walked across the field, he was struck by an eerie, absolute silence which had settled over the environment. He was about to hop over a small stone wall when the object emitted another flash, and he could now see it clearly. He said it was shaped like a crescent moon, a kind of a half circle with the flat side down. From his perspective, it looked like it was resting on 2 thick metal landing legs, and in the center what looked like a ladder led down towards the ground. Juan again had the impression that it was waiting for him. He could see circular portholes around the circumference of the craft, and through the portholes he could see humanoid figures wearing dark clothing and what looked to him like earmuffs on their heads. They were staring at him, and at this point he was only a few meters away. There was one small stone wall separating him from the craft, and as he started to jump over this final wall, the craft emitted another very powerful flash of light. This time it came from the top of the craft, and the flash of light was so bright it blinded him so that he gave up trying to climb this wall. He said he saw what looked like a strange symbol on the craft, and this made him wonder if this device was actually a secret military craft of some kind. After a few moments, the strange craft rose slowly and then moved off, disappearing into the distance and leaving behind a kind of, quote, burning odor. After it was gone, Juan felt a deep sense of unease and realized that he had been very close to something extraordinary. The case is admittedly sparse on details, but certainly interesting. It's interesting to me that this witness felt like the UFO was flashing purposefully at him and perhaps wanted to be seen, because we do see that. I also wonder about the description of the humanoids. Could these have possibly been normal humans? Could this have been a reverse engineered craft? If so, what was it doing there? I don't know. Very hard to say, but a really compelling case all around, and I think one that deserves to be well known. All right, now let's move to the next case. This is another that the witness was clearly pretty traumatized by. I call this one Nothing Compared to This. This occurred on June 3rd, 2012, in an undisclosed location in North Carolina, a very rural area. What's interesting to me about this case is that this is a daylight encounter with an apparent landed UFO and humanoids, and judging from the eyewitness testimony, it sounds like he very well may have been taken on board, because there's some amnesia and apparent missing time surrounding this very compelling case. This is a single witness case. The witness is anonymous, so I'll call him Jim. His encounter involves a rare daylight sighting of a landed craft and humanoids. It was about 7:10 on the morning of June 3rd, 2012. Jim had driven to a rural area in North Carolina and parked his truck. He was planning to build a deer stand to hunt deer. He had found a really good spot and arrived there with supplies to build the stand, and was removing supplies from his truck and getting ready to carry them off to this spot on the edge of a field when he looked across this cornfield towards the woods, and movement in the sky caught his eye. He saw what looked to him like a dark object off in the distance. It appeared to be about a few miles away, and he only saw it briefly, so at the time he didn't think much of it. He spent the next few hours building this deer stand, and after it was finished, climbed up into it to make sure it was comfortable and safe, and no sooner did he sit down when he saw, quote, a huge black object hovering low just above the corn. It immediately moved off and disappeared. So Jim says, and I quote, I climbed down from the stand and proceeded to go that way. All kinds of stuff was going through my mind. At first I thought I had imagined the whole thing because it made absolutely no sound, and yet it was less than 100 yards from me. Once I managed to cross the creek and make my way to the edge of the field, I could see the object. I even remembered saying to myself, "Holy sh! It's on the ground!" This feeling of curiosity came over me. I was scared of what I was looking at, but I was drawn to it. I can't explain the overwhelming feeling I had to get closer to it. I felt like something was pulling me to approach this thing. So keeping to the safety of the open field, he skirted along the edge of the woods and was able to approach to about 60 feet away from it. And as Jim says, I looked over towards the cornfield and I saw two people walking towards the object. I thought, oh my gosh, those are kids. I started waving my arms back and forth and I realized that I can't yell or anything. Now at this point, I'm scared, really scared. When the kids get closer, I can see clearly that they are not kids at all. They were midget-like people, and their skin was yellow. They had big eyes, just like you see and hear about on TV, and I thought, holy sh! Aliens! I was seeing aliens. That's the last thing he remembered. As Jim says, I don't even remember getting in my truck and leaving. But I have not been down there since. I was never a believer. Since that day, I have dreams about it. They are so vivid and contain things about what I saw that I don't remember seeing. Jim was so traumatized that he eventually went to see a doctor about it, and as Jim says, I was in the military, and I have seen everything there is to see, but I never seen nothing compared to this. I have only told my doctor about what I saw and 3 other people. They all tell me I should not be drinking. They make fun about it. I took a lie detector test about the incident, and I passed. Now I am looking for answers as to what I saw. When I hear someone's testimony like this, it makes me sad that there are skeptics out there who would ridicule, disbelieve, gaslight a witness, because it's traumatic enough to go through something like this and then have to try to convince others that this happened. So kudos to the witness for taking a lie detector test. I mean, he actually went to his doctor to try and deal with this. That just goes to show how profoundly it affected him. The fact that he's having dreams and stuff about this encounter, the missing time aspect, the amnesia surrounding it, that's a huge red flag, is what I'm trying to say. I think pointing towards there being a lot more going on here than he consciously remembers. I think a lot of witnesses struggle with that, so my heart goes out to all of them. This is not always easy for people to deal with. So now let's move to the last and final case in this compilation. I call this last case, I Told No One. This occurred on November 17, 2018 in Albany, Oregon. And yeah, a lot of witnesses do not talk about it. So I have to give credit to this witness for finally coming forward. But what's really amazing about this case is not only did he see humanoids and a craft, he managed to capture some photographs of it. That's very unusual. The witness in this case is Owen. That is a pseudonym. Due to some health issues, he had been sleeping a lot, but on the night of November 17, 2018, he did not get much sleep. He had gone to bed around 2:30 a.m. and was just beginning to doze off when something very strange happened. As Owen says, suddenly I felt I was being held by my ankles. I opened my eyes and I was kicking my feet, but my feet were 2 to 3 feet in the air above my bed. For less than 1 second, I saw 2 beings with large heads, big, dark, almond-shaped eyes, no discernible noses, small mouths, and no ears. They were approximately 5 foot 10 inches to 6 feet tall, very slender, extremely slender long arms, thin hands with 4 fingers, slightly larger in the knuckles and the ends of the fingers. Each was holding, or trying to hold, each of my ankles. My eyes were fully opened. I was terrified. I saw them, and they saw me looking at them. In a millisecond, the aliens literally became invisible. A very rapid fade out to invisible. So Owen lay there for a few moments trying to understand and process what had just happened when he heard a strange noise coming from the bathroom. It took him a few seconds to realize that it was his cat, but she was making a sound that he had never heard come from her before. So he rushed to the bathroom, turned on the light, and the cat stopped yowling, and he saw that she was in the bathtub, something she had never done before. He called out to her, and the cat immediately jumped from the tub, ran past him, and hid under the couch in the living room. And at this point, something else strange happened. As Owen says, "Something told me to open the front door, like a voice in my head. I opened the door and I saw a very bright light in the sky. It was the size of a softball in the sky at what I estimate was a mile distance, between 500 and 700 feet above the ground." Amazed, Owen dashed back inside, and still dressed only in his underwear, he grabbed his pair of binoculars, ran back outside, and used the binoculars to watch the object, which was now starting to move slowly away. And as Owen says, it looked similar to a Mayan or Incan sun icon, circular, but with quadrangle ends pointing out in 4 directions, essentially a cross superimposed over a circle. Very fine parallel lines could be seen in each section of the quadrangles, pointing away from the brighter, glowing center. As I watched, it began to change shape, like random oscillations of the orb. At this point, Owen realized he should try to take a photograph, so he dashed back inside, grabbed his Samsung Galaxy S8 cell phone, and dashed outside. This object was still moving away, but it was there. He tried to record a video, but in his haste, he was only able to take pictures. He snapped a few pictures and then managed to get it into video mode when, as he says, my phone went completely dead without warning. The glowing object moved off and was gone. Looking at the time, he was shocked to see that it was now 6:30 a.m. Now, he's not sure if there was missing time or not, but he did have photographic evidence, proof that something had happened, and he feels certain that the object he saw was, quote, a craft, and that it belonged to the 2 entities who had just been into his room. As Owen says, I was exhausted and unable to get back to bed. The cat spent 2 weeks under the couch and will not go back into the bathroom, the location of the litter box. I have told no one what happened. Finally, after 1 month, Owen did report his encounter, but only on the condition of anonymity. I think you'll agree that's a pretty important and interesting case, given that he was able to capture photographs of this UFO, which he is convinced were related to the ETs that were in his room only moments before. So, really amazing. It always makes me wonder, what are these ETs doing? Why were they lifting him up like that? Clearly they weren't just examining his feet. Maybe they were returning him. Maybe they were picking him up. Very hard to say for sure. But he knows it wasn't his imagination because he does have photographic evidence. And of course you would have to explain the animal reactions with his cat acting so strangely. A really astonishing case, and one of so many. So there you go, 10 cases coming from all over the world, from 2014 or from 1914 all the way up to 2018. Just goes to show this has been going on a very long time, and you can see that these older cases are very much similar to cases that are much more current and modern. So it seems like this has been going on for a very long time. And it's only the fact that this subject has grown in popularity that we are now hearing more about it. But I would guess that these sort of things have been going on since the beginning since we recorded history, and probably before that. Really hard to say for sure. That's another thing I'd love to do a deep dive into one day, just how far back do encounters go, because we know they go way back. All right, thanks guys. Hope you've enjoyed this episode today. Perhaps learned a little bit. So many humanoids visiting our planet. Clearly it's not just grays. So thanks so much for watching. I truly appreciate it. And until next time, keep asking those questions. Keep searching for the truth. It's up to you to do it. And most important of all, keep having fun. And I will see you next time. Bye for now.